Well, good morning. We appreciate you being here, and I'm so pleased to be joined by the House leaders on the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, Representative David Cicilline and Representative Debbie Dingell from the great state of Michigan, and Representative Ted Lieu, and Representative Matt Cartwright. And so I so appreciate, we have been working as partners to pass legislation that, in fact, will solve problems for the American people. That's what they expect. They expect us to be focused on those things that will improve their lives and improve the lives of their families. And we are laser focused on that. Unfortunately, though, that is not what's happening because the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, has turned the Senate into a legislative graveyard. It's happening in the House. These are the bills, one copy of each of the over 300 bills that have passed the House that are gathering dust on Leader McConnell's desk. It's 5,595 pages. We're not including appropriations and other bills that will be passed. These are important bills that have come here to make a difference in people's lives, and Mitch McConnell has chosen not to act, not to bring them before the United States Senate. It's incredibly important to also underscore that 9 out of 10 of these bills, 90% of this stack, is bipartisan. These are things supported by people across the country, Republicans, Democrats, independents. The American people are united on the need to reduce the outrageous cost of prescription drugs. A recent poll showed 9 out of 10 voters want Congress to take action. The House has, yet here the legislation sits, stuck in Leader McConnell's legislative graveyard. The American people want folks with pre-existing conditions to have their health care protected. The House has acted, and yet here sits legislation stuck in Leader McConnell's legislative graveyard. The people across our country believe that a pension is a promise, yet it's been 146 days since the House passed the Butch-Lewis Act to help families whose pensions are under serious risk right now. And many, many people in Michigan have seen their pensions cut. And yet, here we sit. This is in Mitch McConnell's legislative graveyard. The American people want victims of domestic violence and sexual assault to receive the support they need, and once again, it sits in Mitch McConnell's legislative graveyard. And the American people want Congress to pass universal background checks. Some polls have found more than 90% of the American people support this legislation. Again, Democrats, Republicans, independents, those who are members of the NRA, those who are not. Across the board, people support common sense, universal background checks, but it sits in Mitch McConnell's graveyard. Meanwhile, 100 Americans are killed by guns every day, and our country has seen 396 mass shootings just this year. We're here because we know that we can take action to save lives. I know the United States Senate, we can do that today if Leader McConnell and the Republicans will bring these bills to a vote. Mitch McConnell, Republican members simply need to care enough to act. It's time for Mitch McConnell to stop stalling and do his job. Congressman Cicilline.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. It's great to be with you this morning. And it's been almost a year since the House Democrats assumed the majority in the House. And since that time, we have passed more than 400 pieces of legislation to get the government working for the people. We developed an agenda that focused on the urgent priorities of the American people after listening carefully, and then we began to get to work immediately to deliver on that agenda. And we passed, as I said, more than 400 pieces of legislation. 275 of those pieces of legislation are bipartisan, so they're supported by Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They sit in this pile awaiting action by the Senate, awaiting action by Mitch McConnell, and they sit on his desk collecting dust. In that package includes 10 health care bills that are designed to ensure that we protect coverage for pre-existing conditions, that we drive down the costs of prescription drugs, and that we reverse the sabotage of the Affordable Care Act. Legislation also to raise wages, and legislation to take on the corruption and self-dealing in Washington and getting the government to work for the people again. The Senate Majority Leader has refused to act. Just last week, we passed landmark legislation in the House to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices to bring down the cost for people on Medicare as well as people with private insurance. Again, Mitch McConnell has made no indication that he intends to take any of this legislation up. Folks are still worried about whether or not they have sufficient health care coverage or health coverage at all, and are getting health care sometimes through the emergency rooms. And Mitch McConnell has refused to bring bills to the floor to strengthen coverage for pre-existing conditions and to strengthen the Affordable Care Act. And, they're in fact actively supporting legislation now that would result in the ACA being declared unconstitutional and 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions losing their health insurance. So, very importantly, the Republicans in the Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, have refused to take up any of this legislation. Maybe most importantly, our effort to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. People all across this country are struggling with the cost of prescription drug, cutting pills in half, skipping medication that's necessary to keep them healthy. We have a solution. We've passed legislation, a number of bills to really focus on that. They sit in this pile as well. This is a terrible example to the people of this country. They elect us to work on their behalf, to get things done. We continue to pass important legislation that matters to the American people, and it comes over to the Senate and lands in Mitch McConnell's graveyard. It's time for the Senate Majority Leader to do his job or explain to people why he doesn't want to do anything to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, why he doesn't actually want to invest in fixing our roads and bridges and our crumbling infrastructure, and why he thinks that his main responsibility is to protect the president rather than advance the public interest. And so we're here to say this. The American people should know this is the work that's been done by the House, most of it in a bipartisan way. It is sitting on the desk of Mitch McConnell. It's time he did his job. Bring these bills to the floor for a vote. He doesn't have to vote for all of them, but let the American people know where you stand, whose side you're on, and give the American people an answer as to what's going to happen to all this work that's being done on their behalf. And so I want to thank Senator Stabenow for including us in this important press conference. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to the extraordinary gentlelady from Michigan, Debbie Dingell. The other extraordinary woman from Michigan.
I want to, first of all, thank my colleague for introducing me, and he is the best. But it's also great to be in the House with the Debbie Caucus from Michigan. And I love working with Debbie on so many different subjects because of her passion. She just cares about working men and women across the country, so it's great to be here. Last week, I joined my women colleagues from the House. Dozens of us walked from the House floor to Senator Mitch McConnell's office to demand action on a list of critical legislation as it relates to women. It just makes absolutely no sense as to why we have not acted. Legislation like the Violence Against Women's Act. We have shelters in my home district. I spend a lot of time on them because this is an issue that matters to me, who aren't getting money right now because the Senate will not act. And these women need help, and these shelters are really facing a crisis about whether they can afford it. And while we're talking about violence against women, the police chief of a major city in Texas came out and said, failure to act on the Violence Against Women Act, from keeping a gun out of the hands of someone who is a stalker, been convicted, resulted in the death of a policeman in Texas. When is it enough? When are we going to do something about the Violence Against Women's Act? And that was the second time the women marched from the House. And both times we've just asked to speak with Senator McConnell, and he doesn't want to talk to the women House members. But we're going to keep marching. We're going to keep marching here and marching across the country, demanding action for the hardworking men and women that we represent in our states. Many of my Republican colleagues understand that as well. That's why the House, in a very bipartisan manner, passed the Paycheck Fairness Act with bipartisan votes. In many families with children, the women are either the sole breadwinner or they're a very significant part of the economic they probably do everything, but they're an economic, very responsible for the economic portion of supporting that family. They deserve to be paid fairly for the work. What is wrong with equal pay for equal work? It's time. I've worked at General Motors for 30 decades and watched my colleagues make far more than I, and I was the one that was in at 5:30 in the morning and still there at 10 or 11 at night. And if we do it, if we pass these bills, it's good for families, it's good for the economy, and it's good for our country. And that's why we're here today, to say to Senator McConnell, please do your job. And now I'm very happy to introduce my colleague from California, Congressman Ted Lieu, who's looking really great today.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm honored to be here with Senator Stabenow, as well as my House DPCC colleagues, David Cicilline, Debbie Dingell, and Matt Cartwright. This pile of legislation right here, over 300 bills, is filled with common sense ideas, such as the Save the Internet Act. It also has some very simple fixes to prior legislation, such as a bill that would reverse tax increases on millions of Americans. I want to now focus on something I know we all agree on, which is veterans. And in this pile of bipartisan legislation, there are 30 bills for veterans. Bills that would help combat veteran suicide, help veterans buy homes and make sure veterans can not get on the streets and be homeless, and also make sure that veterans have access to jobs and make sure they have child care for their families when they go to work. I'm a veteran myself. These are bipartisan bills that both Republicans and Democrats support, and they're gathering dust right now on Senator McConnell's desk. In fact, some of these bills aren't just bipartisan, they're actually Republican bills, and many of them have Senate counterparts. So we're just asking Senator McConnell to do his job, put these bills up for a vote. Over 300 bills on his desk, over 275 are bipartisan. Just put them up for a vote. If the Senate votes them through, great, it'll get on the president's desk. If not, then it won't, but at least we know that there was a vote. And so we're simply asking Leader McConnell to go ahead and put these up for a vote, and we can move America forward. And with that, I would now like to introduce Representative Matt Cartwright from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Congressman Lieu, and thanks to all of you for gathering. I hope we haven't worn out our welcome already this morning, but I thank Senator Stabenow for welcoming us here, and I hope she hasn't worn out her printer with all of these bills. This is quite a gigantic stack of bills, and it does include over 275 bipartisan bills. Of course, that means Republicans support these bills in the House. And the question is, why are they sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk with no action taken? One of the things that I want to talk about is jobs and the economy. One thing you hear over and over is how low the unemployment rate is right now. But what you don't hear is that so many people are out there working more than one job just to make ends meet. Why? Because the minimum wage has not been increased. 6 months ago, we passed legislation that would raise the minimum wage in the House. It would give more than 33 million Americans bigger paychecks, a chance to work just one job, and a chance for America to grow our economy. The American people are asking for this, but Senator McConnell has refused to allow the Senate even to consider this bill. He has made it clear that he is willing to let it die, despite the will of the American people and despite American workers waiting for their well-deserved raise. We've also acted to give workers more power in the workplace by passing the FAIR Act, which guarantees a day in court and a fair hearing to victims of workplace sexual harassment, victims of wage theft, which goes on constantly and rampantly in the United States, and unsafe working conditions. It's a bill that makes a lot of sense. It's in this stack. Mitch McConnell won't bring it up for a vote at all because of the same reason he won't bring up any of these bills. And don't make any mistake about it. This is all part of a false narrative that Senator McConnell is pushing, that House Democrats aren't doing anything except investigating the White House. That we're foregoing all of our responsibilities in the House just to focus on impeachment. That nothing is further than the truth. That is just a lie that is being perpetrated, and the truth of it is right here in front of you. 275 plus bipartisan bills. That means Republicans in the House supported these bills, and they're sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk in his legislative graveyard, as Senator Stabenow said, and it's not right. We're here to say, Senator McConnell, do your job. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much. I want to thank my House colleagues again for doing great work. I mean, the truth of the matter is there are many things happening right now in the U.S. House of Representatives, both focusing on what needs to be done to protect our Constitution and our democracy, and at the same time move forward on things that people deeply care about and will improve their lives, give them a fair shot to be successful. And the Democratic House of Representatives is doing both, and I believe doing it very well. We just need the Senate to have the opportunity to do the same thing. A vote has been called here in the Senate, so I don't. If there's a question, I'm happy to take one, but then I'm going to have to scoot out. Yes.
I know the House is about to vote on a spending bill. There's some compromises in that plan pointing to research for gun violence,
Right.
also raising the tobacco age to 21. Does that give either or all of you specifically any hope that moving forward some of these compromises might be able to be met?
Well, I want to congratulate everyone who was negotiating that got the gun violence research pieces into this. I've been very involved in the NIH funding and the efforts to move forward broadly on research that are also there, as well as a number of other positive things. So I think what the appropriations process shows is that when people want to get things done, we can. When Leader McConnell wants to get something done, he comes to the table and we negotiate and we get things done. So there's been a tremendous amount of negotiation over the weekend. I've been involved in large parts of that, trying to move things forward, and it's very clear that the leader of the Senate is able to take action when he wants to. We think it's important that he and his caucus care about the things that affect American families every day, what they're worrying about when they get up and they look at how to pay the bills, how to move forward, have a job, make sure they've got the capacity to pay for their prescription drugs, make sure that the pension is there if they're a retiree, all the things that affect real people every single day. If there's a sense of will by the Republican leader in the Senate, if he understands that these are important, if he and his caucus care about what's happening to families every day, we wouldn't have this stack. And we can eliminate this stack if they decide to put the same focus and will on what is in this as what they were focused on in the bills that were just negotiated. Be happy to have anybody else.
I was just going to say, I want to add, to build on what Congressman Lieu and Congressman Cartwright said. This failure to act is not because we can't reach a bipartisan compromise on common sense bills. If these bills came to the floor, virtually all of them would pass. It's really not about demonstrating our ability to do that. We've done that in the House. I expect it would happen in the Senate. There's one reason it's not happening, and one reason alone. The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, refuses to bring those to the floor, and I think it's for just what Mr. Cartwright said. He's promoting this narrative that Democrats are not doing anything but impeaching the president, and so by denying action on these common sense bills that are bipartisan that would pass the Senate, he can promote this false narrative. And so we're calling him out. There's a lot of work being done. I think this is probably the most productive Congress on the House side in modern history. This is evidence of it. We've demonstrated we can work together in a bipartisan way. There's one person standing in the way of real progress for the American people, and that's the Senate Majority Leader.
And let me just say in closing that we know the people of the country are divided on impeachment, but they're not divided on bringing down the cost of their medicine or making sure that if they have a pre-existing condition that they have health care coverage, or stopping the violence that's happening to our children in schools or people on the street, or all of the other things, the veterans bills, the pensions bills, and so on. People are not divided on that. It's overwhelmingly supported, as has been said over and over again, passed by the House in a bipartisan way. There's no excuse for the Senate not to act. All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Senator.